Good morning. There we are. Hello, everybody. Good morning.
You turn us on.
The Bible, lost in translations, and more translations and more translations. That's the topic for today. After 2,000 years, how do we know we have the real Bible? That's what we're going to talk about. I hear this a lot from people. Their impression is that our modern translations came from earlier translations, which were translated from earlier translations, which were translated from earlier ones. My name is Don Barkley. Welcome to Great Questions. This is our fourth one. In our first one, we dealt with the question, what is truth? We started with the basic. Is there truth? And how do we know it? And if you believe that there's a Great Questions class in here and you came, then you believe in truth. You believed whoever told you or wherever you read that there was a class here, you believed it. And you know what? If there is a class in here, then it is a true statement. We all believe in truth. The question is, can we really believe in a particular truth about God? So the next session was, aren't all the religions the same? And we dealt with that. We realized they're really quite different. And so it's not a matter of whether somebody's sincere. It's really a matter of whether it's true or not. Is it really true? Maybe Christianity's wrong. That's what I would tell people. Maybe we're all wrong, but they can't all be right. And so it becomes a matter of investigation, right? Let's look into it. And the third one was on, isn't it too narrow-minded to say that there's only one truth? That Christianity, for instance, is the only way. When you find out that all the religions are narrow, they all believe that their way is the right way. And there needs to be a little humility on all of our parts to not be narrow-minded, but to know that to be narrow is actually a good thing. I want the pilot to land the plane that I'm riding on the runway, right side up. I'm pretty narrow about that. And you are too, I bet. I want my surgeon to be certified, right? So we all are narrow. Then the next question is, okay, then how do you investigate whether, say, our faith is true? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, for the next 3 weeks, the questions. First, is the Bible authentic? And I'll tell you what that means in a second. And then, is the Bible accurate? And that has to do with history. And then finally, is the Bible authoritative? Is it really inspired by God? Is it a book unlike other books, history books or science books? Does it really claim, and is there reason to believe that it's actually written by God as well as by people? So authentic has to do with manuscripts. Do we have good copies of the Bible? That's what we're going to talk about today. Next week, we're going to talk about, is the Bible accurate? Did biblical events really happen? So that we can have authentic documents, but we have authentic documents of Aesop's fables, but did those things really happen? Can you go to the place where the tortoise raced the hare? If your kids ask you, you say, well, yeah, let's go to Greece and we'll find out where it is. And the travel agent will probably think you're nuts. So it's a different question, is it? Did the events really happen? And then is it authoritative? We'll look at the question, was the Bible inspired by God? Okay? So today, is the Bible authentic? Let me give you an example of the question of authenticity. Here's an actual Diners Club receipt. If you read it, let me see if I can read it on here. It's from the United States of America to the Republic of France. And the date is 03. It's for the amount of $827,000. No, 827 acres, square miles, that's what it is, square miles, for a cost of $14 million. And the tax was $1 million, so it comes to $15 million, signed by Thomas Jefferson. Now, did the event really happen? Is this an authentic receipt? No. That's what we're talking about. Is what we have really authentic? Is it the real thing? So it's a good question. There's a common myth. First point, it's a common myth that the Bible was translated from translations. I hear that quite a lot, as I said. I don't know. Have you heard that? And maybe you have come to believe that. That's what we're going to talk about today. It's a popular belief. I don't know if you recognize this guy. This show was set in Newport Beach, California, and his name is David Cross. He's also a stand-up comic, and he says I've got to back up and read it because it's bigger up here. You know, when the Bible was written and then rewritten, then edited and re-edited, and then translated from dead languages, and then re-retranslated, and then re-edited, and then re-re-edited, and then retranslated, and then given to kings for them to take their favorite parts out, and then re-edited, then retranslated, and then re-edited, and then given to the Pope for him to approve, and then retranslated, etc. You get the idea. And he finishes with, I guess the Bible is literally the world's oldest game of telephone. Now, a few minutes ago, a few of you cooperated with me in a little game, a party game called the telephone game. You know what the telephone game is, right? Where one person whispers to somebody, they whisper to the next person. Well, we did that in here, and we started with, I don't know your first. Melinda. Melinda, thank you so much. Melinda started it, and I whispered something to her, and she whispered something to Leslie, and it went all the way down. Cynthia then at the row walked over to the other row and whispered it, and it went all the way to Lewis, right? Okay, so right now I want to hear from Lewis. What do you think the message was, Lewis? Showtime. 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 Wow, did you guys mess it up? Showtime. Now, each of you did your sincere best, right? Let me show you what. So here's the question. First of all, this will tell you kind of what it's all about, and that happened here. This was the message. What I said to Melinda. The Hebrew word for scribe is sofer, meaning counter. Or another way of saying that is showtime. Now, you can see why if people think that the Bible is just a telephone game, we don't have anything close to what was written 2,000 plus years ago, right? I mean, if let's say Moses wrote, and I think traditionalists, and I happen to believe that too, that around 1500 BC, Moses. And then we have the New Testament was written, almost 2,000 years ago, right? So if it's translated from translations over 2,000 years plus, you would think that we would end up kind of with showtime, right? Well, so that's what we're going to talk about. But what I'm going to say, that first of all, I'll start by saying the New Testament, we'll just talk about the New Testament because we have kind of limited time. The New Testament preservation was unlike the telephone game in at least 4 ways, all right? So I think this is in your notes, right? First of all, it was passed on in writing, not in whispers, okay, in writing. Now, if you'd have done it in writing, do you think you would have done better? Probably a lot better. Lewis wouldn't have said showtime. He might have said something closer to what I started with. And not blaming you, Lewis. It's all these other people that messed up, okay? Yeah. Transmission went more than one direction. It didn't just go one direction. It wasn't in just one line. It had several lines. It was like a spider web, and those are called text types. Some went west, some went east, some went south to Africa. And those can be compared. I mean, that's a simplified way of saying that these text types are kind of different lines that you can kind of compare. If we'd had different lines and it was in writing, we could actually compare then the endpoints, right, of all of those different lines or text types. Third, when copies were made, earliest versions were consulted. And we know that just the field called textual criticism is the field of those detectives, those specialists that look at the available manuscripts, not just for biblical manuscripts, but for any alleged ancient manuscripts or manuscripts at all, to determine if we don't have the original, given all these manuscripts, how can we determine what the original said? And that's what we're talking about. So when a copy was made, for instance, we'll look at Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, a picture of 2 of the most famous complete New Testaments in Greek, dated to about the middle of the 300s, 4th century. Okay, and it's thought that they were copied from something maybe as far as 200 years before, pretty close to the events. So when copies were made, earliest versions were consulted. And today, when translations are made, they aren't made from other translations. Although the style of, for instance, the ESV is kind of took on the style, wanted to be the same style as the RSV. The New Living wanted to be characterized as like the original Living Bible, which was written by Ken Taylor for his kids as he commuted from Chicago into his work, from Wheaton into Chicago. And so the styles, but modern translations, even though they want to keep the style, whether it's formal or whether it's more, meaning by meaning rather than word for word, they use specialists. For instance, the New Living Translation, which sounds like a paraphrase, but there were at least 70 translators, specialists. And one of those translators was my wife's uncle, Uncle John Oswald. So we've talked to him about that and what the process was. So translations aren't made from translations. It'd be as if Lewis could walk back and talk to Melinda and ask, what did you hear? And Leslie, right? So maybe we don't have, you couldn't talk to me because we don't have the originals, but you can go back and the more time passes, the more manuscripts we have, and they can go check the earlier ones. Does that make sense? Okay, good. That brings us to the second point. You would think that the further we are in years and decades and centuries from when those documents were written, the less we would be sure what was written, right? This kind of makes sense, and that's what people assume. But because of what it said, even though it's counterintuitive, the more time passes, the more sure we can be about what the Bible said. And why is that? Help me out here. Why is that? The more time passes, we are more sure what the Bible actually said. We keep finding newer manuscripts. What did you say, Donna? Yeah, that's true. We can actually look at it and see being fulfilled. So we see fulfilled prophecy in some ways. And as far as knowing what was originally written, we have many, many more manuscripts. Let me give you why we think it's the real thing, and we can be more sure than ever now. And by the way, even though it made sense just topically to talk about Old Testament and about New Testament. But I'm going to give you an example from the New Testament manuscripts right now, because this is how I answer the question if people don't have 30 minutes, but if they just want like a 2-minute answer, they'll say, well, how can we know what the Bible says if it's translated from translations? I said, let me just kind of give you a story, tell you a story about this question, because it's an excellent question. And so one way that I'll do it is give an example with the New Testament manuscripts. So here's a chart, and notice on the bottom, it says the year, those are the centuries. Can you see that? So from 100 all the way to 2000. Why do I have 1611 highlighted? Because that's when the King James Version was published. And when those excellent translators, commissioned by King James I of England, to come up with an English translation that was accurate and scholarly and also the way people speak. Believe it or not, they spoke like they did, with the these and the thous and the whereofs and the therewiths, etc. And so when they translated, they only had 6 available New Testament Greek manuscripts at the time, only 6. Well, fast forward to, and also, of those 6, the earliest one dated back only to about 1000 CE or AD. 1,000. So we're missing all the manuscripts prior to that at that point. Fast forward to 1881. Now, because of the field of archaeology, biblical archaeology, and just universities just looking for these, now we have about 2,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Not to mention all the other manuscripts of the New Testament, like in different languages, the Latin, for instance. There were probably Latin, and we know there were Ethiopic and Coptic, Egyptian translations. But I'm just talking about Greek New Testament because the New Testament was written in Greek, right? And so, and how early did these manuscripts go? Back to the 4th century. I'll show you pictures of those famous manuscripts. And so you see that as time passes, we have more and we have earlier. So before we had this much and they only go back this far. Now we have this much, and they go back this far. You see how it's just the opposite of what you would think because of the discovery of manuscripts. That makes sense? And now, for instance, in 2005, a translation called the New English Translation, as an example, 5,700 manuscripts now, and that's where we stand, anywhere between depending on how you count them, 5,300 to 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts. And that's a whole lot, isn't it? And the earliest one, guess how far that goes back? Back to just after the turn of the 2nd century. And so dated 130, 125, 115 even, some date this little fragment, the John Rylands Papyrus. If you've been to Manchester Library, any of you, I see heads nodding, Manchester Library, it's about the size of the palm of my hand, both sides of John 18. It's like a foot in the sand when Robinson Crusoe, believes that nobody else is on the island and he sees one footprint. Does he need 18 footprints or 100? No, one footprint is sufficient to say there was a human being here. Well, this is kind of a footprint that says the Gospel of John had to at least have been written before this, right? Now, when I was in church growing up, it was a church that didn't teach authority of the Scriptures or believe in the reliability of them. So I was taught that the New Testament was written in the middle of the 2nd century. They couldn't have taught that if they knew about this, could they? Third point is about the Old Testament. So now we're going to kind of bear down on teaching kind of what information we have about Old Testament documents. Again, this is just kind of hitting the high points and kind of what areas I like to have in mind when somebody asks me the question. And so let's talk about the Old Testament and authenticity, okay? The Old Testament, let me get a drink of water. The Old Testament was written mostly in Hebrew, right? I say mostly. What other language was it written in? Yeah, Aramaic. Yeah, pieces of Daniel. It was the language of the Babylonians. So when nation Israel was exiled to Babylonia, that's the language they speak. And that's why people believe that Jesus in his house spoke the language of Aramaic. It's a cognate language, a Semitic language with Hebrew. So most of it, though, is written in Hebrew, and that's how the script looks. And Aramaic is similar to that also. A manuscript is not like a manuscript of your dissertation today. A manuscript literally means by your mano, by your hand. So it's handwritten copies. The Gutenberg press, movable type, wasn't created until around, 1450? Something like that. So before that, any kind of piece of literature had to be copied by hand, literally just by hand. Imagine how tedious that was, right? So manuscript, that's what we're talking about. So how do you evaluate the authenticity of any manuscript? How do you know this is authentic? Well, there are 3 questions usually that are involved in this. One is quantity. How many of them do we have? Quality. Are they good? Are they full of holes? Are they fragmented? And then the time span between what and what? The time span between the original writing, the time of the original writing. So if John, the Gospel of John, for instance, was written in about 95, I think that's the latest date that scholars would put it at least most traditional scholars. Some would put it later, but that's the minority. Some would put it as early as before 70. But that's take the date of the original writing, say 95 AD, and then look at the date of our earliest copy, which now we have a piece of John that's dated about 125. And so what's the time span? About 30 years, right? 35 years. 35 years between when it was written and the earliest copy. And the shorter the time span, doesn't it make sense? That probably it's more close. It's closer. So if we have an early copy that's like the 4th person, Cynthia, in the row, wouldn't it be better, and there's a time span of whatever, let's say each one is a century. That's 5 centuries to me. What if we have a copy that in Melinda's chair, rather Leslie's chair, that cuts the time span lower, right? So as the years go by, the time span has shrunk. Let's see what's happened. Well, first let's talk about quantity of available Old Testament manuscripts. We'll just go through this really fast because you're curious about this, right? We have 6 key Hebrew manuscripts plus hundreds of Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts. We'll talk about those in a second. And then we have 4th and 5th century Greek translations of the Old Testament, and that's called the Septuagint, right? And those are best represented by those 2 great manuscripts called Sinaiticus, named after Mount Sinai, and Vaticanus, which is named after the Vatican, plus thousands of smaller sections and fragments. So what's the quality of the available ancient Hebrew manuscripts? How good were the copyists? Let's talk about this. F. Bruce at Cambridge wrote about the parchments and the books, and he writes about the scribes. He says, these Jewish scribes wrote with the greatest imaginable reverence and devised a complicated system of safeguards against scribal slips. They counted, for example, the number of times each letter of the alphabet occurs in each book. They pointed out the middle letter of the Pentateuch and the middle letter of the whole Hebrew Bible and made even more detailed calculations than these, and they made up mnemonics by which the various totals might be remembered. That's why the word sofer means counter. It means one who counts. They counted this way, they counted this way. Every letter had to be in the same place on the page for every subsequent copy. So if you put a pin through the letter Aleph in a particular word, it would, a person who is, a rabbi who really knows it, could tell you what letter that pierces in, say, 1 Chronicles 8 or in Job 4. They know, it's like they know where the letters are on the page, and they are situated on the page just like that. The rules for the copying of the scriptures are laid down in the Jewish Talmud. The Jewish Talmud, as you probably know, is the large collections of teachings by the rabbis from about the 2nd to the 5th century, where you have all these rabbinical opinions about different issues, like how do you keep the Sabbath? What constitutes a Sabbath day journey, et cetera, that sort of thing. There were rules regarding the recipe for the ink, the number of columns per page, the number of letters per column line, the exact spacing between everything, letters, words, lines, sections, where the eyes of the scribe could look, what the scribe was to wear, and if a mistake was made, the entire scroll was to be destroyed. Yikes. That's no whiteout allowed in this. And when a scroll got worn, kind of like the proper way to deal with an American flag that's worn, to burn it, well, they would bury. And first they would put it in kind of a pre-burial place. And we have found many of the fragments, old fragments, in the kind of pre-burial place in Egypt. Some of those constitute those fragments that I was talking about. So is there evidence of their accuracy? And this is where I want to really whip through the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I wish I could spend more time, and my wife Ann knows that I agonize over that. I can't take too much time telling the story, so I'll give it to you in a nutshell. First of all, they were found at a place called Qumran. How many of you have been to Qumran? Yeah, wonderful. So you know it's dry, right? Very dry. And was it hot when you were there? Were you there in the hot season? Yep. And it was discovered, started with some Bedouin shepherds who then found this, who throwing rocks in, heard some crashing of pottery, found these leather leaves rolled up. They didn't know what it was. There were scratchings on it, writing on it. So they took it to a cobbler, antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. He took them to the bishop, the metropolitan of Jerusalem, the Syrian Orthodox bishop named Mar Samuel, and he bought them for $250. There were 4 of them, including the great Isaiah scroll, the greatest scroll of all, 24 feet long, practically nothing missing. It's amazing. It's beautiful. And so he bought them because he was raising money for the Palestinian cause, and he thought this would be valuable. What an opportunity. Thank you, God, for dropping these in my lap. But he doesn't know for sure what the writing is. So he takes them to scholars in Israel. First, E.L. Sukenik, who's here, a professor at Hebrew University, and then to an American. And that American sends photos off to William F. Albright at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and Albright wires back, "Congratulations, you have in your possession the most important manuscript find of the 20th century." He's all excited. He takes these to America. This is the director of the Oriental Institute in Chicago. He's showing the great Isaiah scroll to. So he's carrying these things around like in a suitcase. And he tries to sell them, but he can't. The rumored offered price, or the price that he wanted, was $1 million. So he takes out, no kidding, he takes out an ad in the Wall Street Journal. This is the ad. The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. And then there's a box number. Isn't that? And this is authentic. This is the real thing. It's amazing. And so Yigael Yadin, who happens to be the son of E.L. Sukanik, he was born Yigael Sukanik, is an archaeologist. He happens to be in the U.S. and sees this, and he, through liaisons, because he doesn't want the bishop to know that it's Jews who are buying them, he buys them for $250,000, and they end up in Israel, and that's where they are now, those four. So the Isaiah scroll ends up there. Pretty amazing story, isn't it? Boy, you start thinking about archaeology. It's not just going into the ground. It goes into the stories of people's lives. It's really, really interesting. What's the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, one way to look at it is the time span that shrunk. The time span between the original writing and earliest available copies of the Hebrew Bible was significantly reduced by their discovery. And what do we mean by significant? Well, for instance, if we look here before 1947, you see on the right-hand side, 920 AD, that was the date of the earliest Old Testament copy we had, manuscript, called the Aleppo Codex. There was a Leningrad Codex, and those are still major treasures. But that was the oldest we had of the Old Testament in Hebrew. Okay, and if Isaiah wrote in 700 BC or so, that means there's a gap of 1,620 years. That's quite a gap, isn't it? Well, after 1947, dating of the earliest Isaiah scroll now is about 150 BC. That's what William F. Albright put it at, and others put it at. Before Christ, by the way. And if you remember, Isaiah 53 has all these messianic prophecies in it. Like Isaiah 53 has this amazing prophecy of one dying for the sins of others. For all we like sheep have gone astray. Handel knew it when he wrote Messiah. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. But the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It's a chapter you would think was written by the Christian community. And some people thought it was. But now we have a copy of it prior to Christ by at least 100 years. That's pretty cool. And so what is the gap now? It's down to about 675 years. And we still don't, but you think about it, how long does paper last? Who thinks they have an old book in their home? Raise your hand. What's an old book? What's an old book to you? What's an old book that you have? What's the date of that book? 1885. Yes, Keith. 1889. 1890. And you know, that's why it's amazing to, yeah, Walter.
So, her aunt was the librarian in Rhode Island. We went down to the bottom. They have parchments that go back to 1620. And they're absolutely beautiful.
It's back to 1620 AD. And those are remarkably, they're celebrities in the libraries, right? And look, those are 400 years, right? 400 years old. Why? Because things oxidize. Sometimes they're destroyed. Sometimes they're destroyed by fire, but just plain nature. So to find something in the Dead Sea that dates back over 2,000 years is just remarkable. And part of it's the dryness, part of it's they were sealed in the dark, away from the light. And Isaiah scroll, like I say, is practically pristine. So we know it's remarkable to find something like this. How much of the text had changed over 1,000 years? That's kind of the question. How much has changed? And so I'll just read a summary. Miller Burroughs, who was director for the Oriental Institute in Jerusalem and was professor emeritus at Yale, he was one of the first experts to really analyze the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found. He says, it is a matter of wonder that through something like 1,000 years, the text underwent so little alteration. As I said in my first article on the scroll, herein lies its chief importance, supporting the fidelity of the Masoretic tradition. The Masoretes were the guild of copyists, say, starting in about the 5th century AD. It's a long time ago, but that's 5th century AD up until about the 10th century. It was a guild that they followed the rules of the Talmud on how to copy, okay? So he's saying how that guild did so well in copying. Walter Kaiser, who was president of Gordon Conwell and a distinguished professor of Old Testament, he summarized it this way: the state of purity in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls is nothing short of spectacular. For instance, in one complete Isaiah scroll, only 3 words exhibiting different spelling were found for a book that runs about 100 pages and 66 chapters in our English text. Let's go to the New Testament. The New Testament would be characterized as an embarrassment of riches. And let me tell you why. I think you know partly why, is that we have thousands of Greek New Testament manuscripts, plus all sorts of versions. We have the Latin Vulgate, about 9,000 copies of the Latin Vulgate before Gutenberg, 1450, 15th century. Tell you what I mean. Well, first of all, let's start. New Testament was written in Greek, right? Koine Greek, it was the common language of the people. Koine means kind of common or shared, right? Like koinonia in the Greek means fellowship, kind of a shared fellowship. We share together. The quantity of New Testament manuscripts, just in summary, 5,700 plus Greek manuscripts, 9,000 versions in various ancient languages. I think there's 9,000 just in Latin. There's the Syriac, Coptic, Latin, Ethiopic. Here's an example of one of the best, Codex Vaticanus. It's both the entire Old Testament and New Testament in Greek. And now we're talking old. We're talking the 300s. Codex Sinaiticus was found at the foot of the traditional Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery, were the keepers of it for many, and it's still there. I mean, it's never been conquered. That monastery is famous. It's never been conquered by all the waves of empires changing hands. It's been there for many, many centuries. Also, here's a copy of the Chester Beatty and Bodmer papyrus. Those are two different ones. One discovered in 1930 and one discovered, this is a body of texts, papyrus documents, and then another papyrus document body found in about 1951. So you see, as the decades go on, we have, and these are earlier than Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, with huge chunks. The whole Gospel of John, for instance, is included in the Chester Beatty. Here's what the little papyrus looks like, the Rylands fragment, or the John Rylands fragment, or John Rylands kind of P52, they call it, Papyrus 52, very famous. Both sides of John 18, which is the trial of Jesus with both the religious judges, the Sanhedrin, and Pontius Pilate, the Roman judge. Comparison of ancient texts, just to give you what we're going to look at is the date written, say Tacitus wrote the Annals, who writes about the Caesars, wrote about 100 or so. Earliest copy is 850 AD. That's quite a time span, isn't it? Between the earliest copy and when it was written, 730 years approximately, and the number of copies is 36. There are great classes, great professors and scholars who study the writings of Tacitus and teach about the history of Rome based on the history of Tacitus. Nobody's perfect, but he's a bona fide historian and considered a great historian. Thucydides, who I think writes about the war with Sparta. I'm not sure. I get the Peloponnesian and Punic and Spartan wars mixed up. But ancient historians would lean on Thucydides. He wrote in about 460, 400 BC. The earliest one we have is 1st century AD, 400-year gap. And we have 188 of those. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, his conquest of what we know as France, right, or that area, written in about 50 to 58 BC. Earliest copy is 900 AD, which makes sense. Remember, that was the date of the earliest copies of many of the biblical manuscripts, before the Dead Sea Scrolls and before the finding of some of these New Testament manuscripts. Time span, 940 years, and now there are 251 of those, of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. The New Testament, written between 45 and 95, earliest extant copy, 115 to 130, that's the Rylands fragment. So there's a gap of 20 to 85 years, and there's 5,700 of those. So the moral of the story is, if you reject ancient Greco-Roman writings on the basis of lack of manuscript evidence, if you reject the Bible on lack of manuscript evidence, so let me rewind. If you reject the Bible, the New Testament, for instance, on the on the basis of the lack of manuscript evidence, what would you have to do with these? So that's why it's called really an embarrassment of riches. And you wonder, okay, that there's not just that Ryland's papyrus, that 1 foot in the sand. We have between 10 and 15 manuscripts within 100 years of the completion of the New Testament. Within 100 years. And then we have about 4 dozen within 2 centuries. And this is from Daniel Wallace, who's an expert in the field of textual criticism of the New Testament. And he says if the average size manuscript from 2 1/2 inches is 2 1/2 inches thick, all the copies of the work of an average Greek author would stack up about 4 feet high, while the copies of the New Testament would stack up over a mile high. You compare, 188 to 5,700. And there's a recent article where that was challenged, and so he does the math. He knows he has a nonprofit company that with several staff that go around the world, and their task is to, take high resolution photos of every known New Testament Greek manuscript. And that's what his group does. Yeah, Keith. I don't know that, Keith. I wish I knew that. Yeah. You think it is? Yeah, okay. Yeah. It's quite different, isn't it? Yeah. And of course, the difference, as I understand, between the Quran and this is there's only one line that they would be interested in, right? They don't assign textual critics to different manuscripts to discover what the original said. They kind of choose which ones, yeah. There is another major difference between now we're getting toward the end. There is another major difference between ancient Greek and Roman writings and the New Testament. Because there are so relatively few ancient copies, there are gaps in the text. Missing words, phrases, even sections. So there are missing sections. So what does a textual critic have to do? They have to kind of guess what went in there, because we have less of the original, maybe 80%. Well, that's different than with the New Testament. The New Testament, however, because of the sheer volume of manuscripts, gaps aren't the problem. We have additions to the text more than the original. I have a professor in seminary, Harold Honer from Cambridge, expert in the text, said, we actually have 105% of the New Testament. Which says it's there somewhere. It's there somewhere. The non-need to guess about the wording of the original New Testament means that in virtually every instance, the original reading is to be found somewhere in the manuscripts. Isn't that interesting? And then finally, how well was the New Testament copied? There are many, many variant readings, some 300 to 500,000 variant readings in those 5,700. And Bart Ehrman kind of scares people with the thought that there are actually more variants than there are words in the New Testament. But it's misleading, because there are so many that turns out to be less than 1%. It's a percent of a percent compared to the volume of writings. And here's one conclusion that textual critics make is all but 1% are easy to spot. Spelling errors, varied spellings, mistakes, nonsense readings, changes in word order that don't affect translation, etc. So you can kind of find, yeah, here's a difference. Like here, John is spelled with 2 N's, 2 news, and here only with 1. Sometimes Jesus, or a name like Mary or Joseph, has a definite article before it. Sometimes it doesn't change the meaning. Sometimes the syntax is different, which doesn't change the meaning, because they decline nouns, not just conjugate verbs. So you can take a subject and put it at the end to give emphasis to the direct object, for instance, you grammar fans, and it'll mean the same thing. And sometimes the writer will sense that emphasis in the context and change it, but it doesn't change the meaning. Our pastor at Irvine Presbyterian Church, many of us are from there, Mark Roberts, whose PhD is from Harvard University in New Testament and Christian Origins. In his excellent book, Can We Trust the Gospel, says if you were to take 2 different teams of text critics and ask them to work independently on a critical edition of the Greek New Testament, they would agree more than 99% of the time. Notice he says more than 99% of the time. Why? Because they're easy to spot. It's just like that famous correction in Reader's Digest, that I read it there, from a newspaper that said, correction, yesterday reported that Sergeant Wilson was a defective in the police force. What we meant to say was that he's a detective in the police farce. They actually printed that. Now, can you detect the error there? Of course you can. Well, so much of the New Testament variation is just like that. And so, bottom line, what's cool about this, and let me just read a conclusion by kind of the dawn of textual criticism for so many decades. Bruce Metzger, who was the professor at Princeton Seminary for over 40 years, when asked what a lifetime of studying the New Testament manuscripts has done to his faith, Bruce Metzger said, "It has increased the basis of my personal faith to see the firmness with which these materials have come down to us, with a multiplicity of copies, some of which are very, very ancient. I've asked questions all my life. I've dug into the text. I've studied this thoroughly, and today I know with confidence that my trust in Jesus has been well placed." Isn't that cool? So when it gets down to it, it's very encouraging. If you wonder, do we really know what Jesus said, or what he thought, what was thought to be said? Do we really know what the eyewitnesses and associates of eyewitnesses and the Apostle Paul, do we really know what they actually wrote? And I think we can say yes, because we have an embarrassment of riches. And because we have an embarrassment of riches in manuscripts, we don't have to be embarrassed when we're asked the question, how do you know we have the real Bible? And when people ask a question like, isn't from translations and translations, I don't need to say, well, that's dumb. No, I can say, you know what? A lot of people believe that. I used to believe that. And I can say to him or her, just like I could say to many people that are skeptical for a reason, I can say, you know, if I believed about Christianity, what you believed about Christianity, I wouldn't be a Christian either. But the issue is, they don't know. And so it's an opportunity to explain. And so I've given you sort of a kind of what I explain, how I explain it. And before we go to Q&A time, we have a short time, let's close in prayer, okay? Well, Father, thank you for this body, this rich body of manuscript evidence that dates back to, it almost is a it's a defeat of the laws of nature. How these old ancient parchments and papyri are still here. Thank you for their protection. We thank you that they are now being digitized and we can know them. And we thank you too that even next week, next month, certainly in the next 5 years, we will find even more Old Testament and New Testament manuscripts. Thank you, Lord, so much for what you've done in giving us this word of God that was preserved so well through the ages. Thank you for those that participated. And we are grateful recipients. In Jesus' name, amen. So let's, before we start the questions, just next week, we're going to deal with the question, is it accurate historically? So now we're going to look into, are there ways to know whether what was written really happened? Did the events really happen? Taking questions if you have them. Any question? Yes, Janet.
In review, so the first part of the Bible that was found, scrolls, what stories in the Bible or what books in the Bible were first exposed?
Wow, that's a great question. Like the question is, like when the Bible was first discovered or found, what stories were in there? Well, I think the farther you go back, the more, in some ways, the more manuscripts could be available. So early on, for instance, even though the King James writers didn't have more than 6, you press back even further, they had the entire Old Testament. So they had all the Old Testament, all the stories from Genesis to what we know as, Nehemiah, Ezra, Esther. And so they had it all. But, I've never been asked the question quite that way. I'll have to think about that, Janet. Yeah. I'll think about it. Okay? Thank you. Yes, Cynthia.
On this paper, after Julius Caesar, you have 50 to 58 Christian era, but your slide said BC. So
Oh, it should be BC. Correct. Yes. Thank you. That was a test. Yeah, and you passed. So on your handout, thanks. On the handout you have on the chart, when you see Julius Caesar, when it was written, that should be BCE or BC, before Christ. So his conquest of course, his work was done prior to the time of Christ. Yeah. Other questions? And we have a mic too. Alex has, we can hear the question live.
What was the group that was at Qumran that was writing, or a special group of people that
Yeah.
were doing this, the writing of the, where
Yeah.
they,
Right. Did y'all hear the question? Special group at Qumran, what were they? They think they were called the Essenes. They were separatists, Essenes, separatists who separated from the kind of the institution and organized Judaism and went down to the desert. And we think they're the ones who preserved not only the scripture writings, but writings of their own history and the ways of the people and many other things too. But yeah, the Essenes. Yeah. Other questions? Oh, I overheard, Paul, your question. How old were the Dead Sea Scrolls? Yeah, they depending on the particular scroll, but the scroll of Isaiah, they date them all between about 200 BC to about 100 AD. Okay, and the Isaiah scroll, each one is kind of particularized by the different means of however the paleographers do that. The great Isaiah scroll, which is so important to us, is dated about 150 BC. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, we're at 11 o'clock. You are dismissed. Don't forget to study for the exam next week. I'm kidding. Great to be with you. Good. Thanks, Denny.